Hello everyone. The first novel, the first piece of fiction that you're reading for this Introduction to Literature course is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Frankenstein celebrated its 100-year anniversary last year, 2018. So we are, not 200-year anniversary last year, 2018. So we are now 201 years into the original publication of this novel, written by a very young woman in the 19th century. I wanted to give you a little bit of information about Mary Shelley herself and then talk a little bit about the plot of Frankenstein. So Mary Shelley has a somewhat revolutionary lineage. She comes from two parents who were activists and writers. Her mother was the proto-feminist Mary Wollstonecraft, and by proto-feminist we mean somebody who expressed or espoused feminist ideals before we had a term for what feminism was, which is the wish for equality between the sexes. And Mary's mother died very shortly after Mary was born, and she was never able to know her mother. And then her father is William Godwin. He was also a radical thinker, a novelist, and considered by some to be an anarchist. So I have given you links within the Frankenstein's extras folder on Blackboard, links to both Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin's work so that you can see that. She had a relationship with a man named Percy Bysshe Shelley, who is also an author. You might know him from his poem Ozymandias, which is a reference to the last scene in Breaking Bad, the last episode of Breaking Bad. And I believe in that episode they read Ozymandias, which is written by Shelley. So when Mary Shelley met Percy, he was married, and Mary and Percy fell in love anyway and decided that they wanted to be together. And so Percy left his pregnant wife for Mary Shelley, and they went off to parts of Europe to celebrate their relationship. Shortly after Percy left his wife, that wife who was pregnant would jump off of a bridge and commit suicide. So in the time period and for the parents that she had, this was indeed scandalous. Obviously, her parents being revolutionary thinkers, they weren't as scandalized, or her father wasn't as scandalized, but he still didn't approve of it. So she had a somewhat strained relationship with her father, given this relationship with Percy Bysshe Shelley, because all of the events and the trauma and the drama that happened around this time, you can start to see some of the glimpses, some of the possible connections to Mary Shelley's life depict themselves in Frankenstein. So the birth of Frankenstein happened when she and her then husband, Percy, would go to Switzerland to spend time with friends. One of their friends was the notorious Lord Byron, also an author, also known for being somewhat of a player, if you will, liked to have a lot of different relationships, and none of them really very formal or very long. And so they were staying at I think it was a guest house of some sort in Switzerland. They were writers. The fourth person was a stepsister. So there were two couples. According to a BBC documentary that you can find and watch on Mary Shelley, there was probably some opiates being consumed. So kind of a party atmosphere. But because there were three writers in the room and the weather was terribly cold for a summertime in Switzerland, they challenged themselves to write ghost stories in the manner or tradition of Germanic ghost stories. So they kind of made this wager of who can come up with the best ghost story the quickest. And Mary Shelley, was the only one who actually produced a work. She shared her work with her colleagues at the time in the Swiss house, and they liked it, and they thought it was really good and that it should be published. Unfortunately, at the time, women were not able to publish literature. It was frowned upon for women to be writers. And so the first publication of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein was published anonymously. When it was found out later that Mary Shelley was indeed a woman, because people did not react well initially to Frankenstein and the idea that somebody would have the audacity to play God, when they found out that she was a woman writing this, the outrage was even greater. So the initial reaction to Frankenstein was not necessarily good. It wasn't well received, and then again, when they found out it was a woman who had written the piece, they were even more outraged. But time has told the story of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and the fact that we are still reading it 201 years later. So at some point she was able to publish the piece under her own name, but originally she was not. Some of the influence that occurred during the time in which Shelley wrote this piece were the fact that they were going through scientific innovations and advancements just as we do now, and one of the advancements, you can call it, at the time was something known as galvanism, where you could take something that was inanimate and no longer living. So in the picture that you have there, you have frog's legs. So you have a dead and spliced up animal part, but if you apply a shock to the animal and its muscles, it will twitch. And at the time, that was revolutionary. It was fascinating, and there was this idea that because we could apply this electrical current to something, we could reanimate it, we could bring it back to life. Which is why when you watch old movies of Frankenstein, you will see the crazy Dr. Frankenstein with his creature and all of the instruments, and the lightning comes and it's alive. So that was the idea behind galvanism. Obviously, we have proven that just because you apply electrical current to something does not mean that it's living, but there was this idea at the time during Mary's lifetime that this could be a way to reanimate, to rebirth, if you will, those who are no longer living. So you have that scientific advancement happening during Mary Shelley's life. You also have just the notion of death surrounding Mary Shelley and why she might be interested or invested in writing about bringing people back. Mary Shelley lost her mother shortly after her mother gave birth to her, so she never knew her. But obviously her mother left a legacy with her writing, and I'm sure, as would any child, she wanted to know who her mother was. We have Percy's wife committing suicide, Mary Shelley's half-sister commit suicide, and 3 of the 4 children that Percy and Mary had together would die before they reached adulthood. So death surrounded her in a lot of ways. Obviously, mortality rates were lower during the time that Mary Shelley was alive because medications were not as good as they are today. But that's still a lot of death for a young woman who is just married to someone and has escaped to the countryside of Switzerland. So those were definitely influences. And then, as I had referenced, the fact that she and her two writer friends, Lord Byron and Mr. Percy, were interested in writing these Germanic ghost stories that they were reading when they were staying in Switzerland and the weather was cold and gloomy and windy. So some other literary and artistic allusions and influence. I have a picture of Fuseli's painting The Nightmare. This might be something that you've seen before, but Milton's Paradise Lost, Ovid's Metamorphoses, and Dante's Inferno, and then the Prometheus Greek myth. I just read a book on Greek mythology and learned a little bit more about Prometheus, but all of these were possible influences that inspired Shelley to write this particular piece. This story, this short novel, is framed in such a way that we don't hear from one narrator, we hear from multiple, and because of that, one of the questions we should have as readers is who can we trust and whose story is authentic. We're hearing things second and third hand, and so is it glorified? We know after reading that Mr. Walton is enamored with Dr. Frankenstein. He thinks he's a wonderful, successful person. He seems almost to have this unabashed respect and admiration for the man. And then, if that's the case, can he be entirely objective about the story? So think about how the story switches and who we can trust or who we cannot trust. And then a short synopsis of the plot of Frankenstein. We begin with Robert Walton's letters to his sister. So he is also an ambitious man who is seeking to conquer the Arctic Circle. He wants to sail that way, and he is encountering as equally as ambitious man in Dr. Frankenstein, who wanted to reanimate life. And so you have two ambitious men who meet by chance and who are inspired or influenced by one another. We have Victor Frankenstein's early life, in which we learn a little bit about where Frankenstein grew up, what his family situation was. We learn about him going to college and creating the creature and how he pretty much isolated himself from everyone else to create that creature. And then we have the consequences of that creation, when the creature is created, when it is born, and then when Frankenstein essentially abandons it. We then hear from the creature, again, by word of mouth, by second, third hand, but we hear the creature's side of the story, how he tries to educate himself, how he tries to make friends, and how that does not succeed, and the aftermath that ensues because of those connections or misconnections. And then we end again with Walton's letters back to his sister. So that is a short synopsis of the plot. That is a bit of information on the biography of Mary Shelley and the time in which she lived, and some of the influences that could have caused her to write such a tale. Enjoy reading Frankenstein. Thanks.